Iran's defenses were already crippled by stealth bombers and advanced fifth-generation fighter jets from the U.S., which ravaged much of the country's military infrastructure. But now, a new, terrifying chapter unfolds with the arrival of the B-52 Stratofortress. This venerable 74-year-old bomber has emerged as a formidable force in the conflict, unleashing an extraordinarily powerful assault on Iran. The Iranian regime is now facing an undeniable truth. The war is slipping from their grasp as B-52s relentlessly pulverize everything in their path. This strategic move is nothing short of brilliant on the part of the U.S., signaling a long-term plan aimed at dismantling Iran's regime permanently. If you want to delve deeper into this masterstroke, stay tuned with us. The arrival of the B-52 stands out as a significant and latest development in the ongoing Iran conflict. This large, imposing bomber is now operating with near impunity over Iranian airspace, starkly demonstrating that Tehran's air defenses are essentially bankrupt and powerless to thwart a U.S. bomber, which, despite its age and lack of stealth technology, wreaks considerable havoc. Consider it this way. The U.S. began by forcefully breaching Iran's defenses with the help of numerous American and Israeli fighter jets. Now the B-52 fleet has entered the fray, effectively bombing what remains of Iran's military infrastructure into oblivion. This marks a transition from surgical precision to overwhelming brute force. Interestingly, this might seem contradictory given the initial U.S. and Israeli offensive unleashed nearly 1,000 targeted strikes within the first 24 hours of conflict initiation. Yet those strikes were precisely surgical. Preceding these air raids was an electronic warfare campaign involving cyber operations that jammed and spoofed Iranian radar systems. With communications compromised, the initial waves of US and Israeli airstrikes swept in, destroying air defenses, naval and aerial assets, and executing decapitation strikes aimed at Iranian leadership, including the late Khamenei. That brutal first day was a firestorm of unparalleled precision. Something Iran did not anticipate. What Iran failed to reckon with was that this ferocious opening salvo was only the prelude. With the surgical phase complete, the U.S. is now delivering devastating sledgehammer blows to already weakened targets, and Iran finds itself unable to respond effectively. The B-52 bombers have arrived, and shortly, we will explain exactly how they are operating within Iran. But first, let's appreciate the sheer power these bombers bring to the battlefield. Unlike the B-2 stealth bombers previously seen executing marathon 30-hour-plus bombing runs, the B-52 is a non-stealth aircraft. This means it cannot sneak past enemy radars and air defenses like its newer, more sophisticated, and expensive counterpart. However, the B-52 excels in a different role. When air superiority has already been secured, it can relentlessly destroy targets on the ground. It has an enormous payload capacity, carrying around 70,000 pounds of munitions. Fully utilizing this capacity, the U.S. loads B-52s with precision-guided weapons, targeting the remaining fragments of Iran's defenses and military command nodes. As Max Afterburner elaborates further in his analysis, the B-52's arrival signals a shift toward overwhelming firepower, intended to systematically dismantle Iran's military capabilities and accelerate the downfall of its regime. Let's dive into the impact of the arrival of B-52 bombers in Iran. This isn't just any aircraft. It's a significant force multiplier in the battlefield. The B-52 is a real heavy hitter, capable of carrying an astonishing payload of 70 JDAMs or joint direct attack munitions. Just the sheer number of jams tells you the kind of firepower this bomber brings to the fight. These guided air-to-surface weapons come in several sizes: 500-pound, 1,000-pound variants. When we talk about 70 jams, it's generally assumed that these B-52s are equipped with the 1,000-pound bombs. However, as Afterburner points out, this choice might not always be the best. Even with air superiority largely established, there's still the risk of isolated surface-to-air missile systems suddenly activating and firing upon a B-52. Let's take a closer look at Iran's current air defense situation. While Iran's air defenses have been heavily damaged, they are far from completely wiped out. This lingering threat makes it necessary for America's B-52s to carry JASSMs, Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles. These subsonic missiles vary in range but can fly anywhere from 230 to 575 miles depending on the variant. The ability to launch JASSMs from a significant distance allows B-52 bombers to strike targets in Iran without entering the range of the remaining air defense systems, offering a safer operational envelope. This ties back to the role and timing of the B-52s in the context of ongoing operations. US B-2 bombers, known for their stealth and precision, have executed surgical strikes against key targets, effectively paving the way for the B-52s to operate with increased safety. With the B-2 bombs devastating what's left of Iran's defenses, the B-52s can focus on critical targets. According to Afterburner, the primary focus of these older but still lethal U.S. bombers is the command and control C2 nodes that are vital for coordinating Iran's military defense. Once these nodes are neutralized, Iran's command structure starts to crumble. Their missile launches become isolated incidents, production facilities get hit, and their capabilities to reload and rebuild are essentially eradicated. In plain terms, the B-52s are targeting and destroying the very systems that enable Iran to wield its most potent threat against the use: the ballistic missiles. Before we delve more into Iran's missile capabilities, let's confirm these insights with another source. The Warzone Analysis and Afterburner agree that the B-52s are significantly damaging Iran's C2 infrastructure. This viewpoint is reinforced by a statement from Air Force General Dan Kane, who highlights that Iran's command and control structures are severely compromised. Part of this is due to a strategic shift from precision strikes to sheer power. On day 4 of the campaign, CENTCOM, Strategic Command, is already transitioning from large, deliberate strike packages that rely on standoff munitions, launched from outside enemy threat ranges, to launching precision strikes directly over Iran. General Kane suggests that it's more fitting to say that precision and power are now operating in tandem in this new phase of the conflict. Regardless of the terminology, the impact on Iran is undeniable. The arrival of the B-52s has rendered a deep wound into Iran's military coordination and operational capabilities, and the results of this arrival are already immense and unmistakable on the ground. Let's dive into the sheer scale of the strike operations unfolding. Right after the initial 24-hour blitz of 1,000 strikes, the United States, alongside Israel, has surged to double that intensity. Within the first 72 hours of this intense conflict, these two allies have collectively smashed over 2,000 targets inside Iran. A major contributor to this ramp-up has been the B-52 bombers, which have unleashed standoff munitions on targets that are increasingly vulnerable, largely because Iran's air defense network has proven far weaker than anticipated from the very start. According to PBS News, Iran's health ministry reported 920 fatalities as of March 4th. Although it remains unclear whether these casualties are civilians or military personnel. Other sources, like the Jerusalem Post, offer a grimmer picture, estimating that more than 1,000 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps perished during the initial salvo strikes. Taking these figures together, it's reasonable to conclude that the death toll has only climbed since America's B-52s intensified their campaign, ending any semblance of resistance. This force of destruction is staggering. However, the most significant effect of the arrival of these powerful American bombers might not be just the immediate destruction, but the strategic damage inflicted on Iran's defensive capabilities. Earlier, we highlighted that the US B-52s appear focused largely on dismantling Iran's command and control C2 nodes. In conventional ground warfare, these nodes are critical for coordinating troops and managing logistics. But this conflict is not a typical ground war. Iran's primary leverage lies in its vast stockpile of ballistic missiles. Iran Watch noted that U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, estimated Iran had over 3,000 ballistic missiles as of 2022. Given Iran's prior missile attacks on Israel and U.S. military bases before and during the current conflict, a considerable part of this arsenal has likely already been expended. At the war's outset, the Israel Defense Forces assessed Iran's missile inventory to be about 2,500. Regardless, the number remains dauntingly high. Thanks to the B-52 strikes, Iran's ability to make the most of this massive missile stockpile is severely compromised. By taking out these critical C2 nodes, the U.S. effectively disrupts Iran's coordination of missile launches. When combined with targeted strikes on missile launch sites, this cripples the one major power projection Iran can wield. The impact is clear in reported data. A CNN article from March 4th quoted a Pentagon briefing by KA, revealing that Iran's ballistic missile capability is gradually being eroded. As of that morning, U.S. Central Command was making steady headway. Theater ballistic missile launches from Iran had decreased by 86% compared to the first day of conflict. A 23% drop occurred just in the preceding 24 hours. Additionally, there was a 73% decrease in the success rate of Iran's one-way attack drones. This information paints a picture of Iran's military strategy slowly being dismantled piece by piece, with the newly deployed B-52s playing a pivotal role. Yet, if you recall from earlier, we mentioned that dispatching B-52s was a masterstroke by the U.S. military. Interestingly, the large-scale destruction of Iran's offensive weapons isn't the primary reason for this genius move, though it certainly plays a significant role. The strategic implications run deeper, influencing both the battlefield and beyond. Let's dive into another crucial reason behind the U.S. military's strategic choices. But before we do, if you appreciate this level of insight, make sure you're subscribed to the Military Show. We unpack complex military developments just like this every single week. So what exactly makes the arrival of the B-52 such a brilliant move by the U.S.? Back on March 2nd, President Donald Trump gave us an important clue. He suggested that the conflict with Iran could last much longer than some expect. While the U.S. initially projected the war to span about 4 to 5 weeks, Trump emphasized that the military is prepared to sustain operations well beyond that time frame. In other words, the U.S. is already bracing for a multi-week conflict. And keep in mind, we are still in the very first week. Moreover, the U.S. must prepare for the possibility that this war drags on even longer. This brings up a critical consideration. The U.S. has to find a balance between applying relentless pressure on Iran with massive firepower, while simultaneously keeping operational costs manageable. Here is where the true genius of deploying the B-52s rather than continuing to rely on the newer, stealthier B-2 bombers shines through. It's tempting to imagine the U.S. military as a limitless force with an endless budget, but in reality, they are mindful of not wasting money where it's unnecessary. One major financial pitfall could have been relying heavily on the B-2 bombers for every bombing run throughout this extended conflict. Put simply, as 1945 magazine explains, capable of carrying large volumes of precision-guided munitions, the B-52 has a long loiter time and costs less per hour to operate than the B-2. This means the B-52 is perfectly suited for sustained bombardment missions once the airspace is relatively secure. And right now, Iran's skies are permissive enough to make this a viable strategy. When it comes to cost, W highlights that getting a B-2 into the air costs roughly twice as much as launching a B-52. The B-2 stealth coatings require heavy maintenance, making the advanced bomber ideal for initial surgical strikes that maintain the shock and awe element, but not for prolonged missions. After delivering the opening strikes, the B-2 pulls back, allowing bombers like the B-52 to carry on the sustained assault. There's another crucial cost factor to consider. Each B-2 costs about $2 billion to build. Losing even one to enemy fire or a malfunction during operations over Iran would represent a significant financial blow to the military's budget for this conflict. By comparison, the B-52 has been undergoing continuous overhauls. By 2021, the U.S. had invested $15 billion as part of a massive $48.60 billion to $60 billion program designed to keep these aging aircraft flying through 2060. Currently, the U.S. operates 76 B-52s. Even factoring in the overhaul costs, each updated B-52 ends up costing around $640 per unit, plus the original production cost adjusted for inflation, which was about $1.14 billion, according to EG Guidespace. So, deploying the B-52 means less financial risk. Even if one goes down, it's not nearly as costly as losing a B-2. To sum up, the B-52 provides the U.S. military a cost-effective way to maintain ongoing pressure on Iran during a war that could last far longer than initially expected. It allows the B-2s to do what they do best, delivering precise, high-impact opening strikes, while the B-52 handles the prolonged bombing campaigns without draining the budget or risking extremely expensive hardware. This smart division of labor makes the B-52's presence on the battlefield not just practical, but an exceptionally savvy strategic move. Losing a B-52 bomber is indeed a costly setback, but it pales in comparison to the loss of a far more expensive and sophisticated B-2 bomber. Let's break down the operational costs behind these aircraft. According to the national interest, a single hour of flight time for a B-2 bomber costs approximately $200,000. During the recent surgical strike operations, the B-2s deployed by the United States over Iran were airborne for over 30 hours. That translates into more than $6 billion in flight expenses for that mission alone. Why? In contrast, the B-52 bomber costs roughly $70,000 per hour to operate. Adjusting for inflation, this cost remains about half of what the B-2 requires per hour, aligning perfectly with what experts like W have pointed out. From a sheer cost efficiency perspective, switching to B-52 bombers is a strategic masterstroke. It enables the U.S. to deliver massive firepower against Iran by utilizing highly advanced weaponry that the B-52 can carry, yet at a fraction of the expense demanded by the stealthy B-2. If the Trump administration expects to sustain such a campaign for 4 to 5 weeks or longer, the transition to B-52s was essential to ensure continuity without draining the defense budget excessively. Now, turning to the current situation on the ground and in the skies over Iran, it's clear that Iran is facing considerable challenges. We've discussed aspects of this, especially regarding the status of their ballistic missile forces and the efficacy of their air defenses, but the air defense issue deserves a deeper dive. Iran's integrated air defense system does not match the sophistication found in Western countries. As noted by Afterburner even before the bombing started, Iran's air defense comprised Chinese and Russian surface-to-air missiles, SAMs and radar systems, which have since been systematically demolished by the B-52s and other U.S. bombers. In fact, Iranian air defenses were already on the losing side before hostilities escalated. An article from Army Technology dated March 3 sheds more light on this. It points out that Iran's air defense network is not made up solely of the Chinese and Russian units that Afterburner cited. While Iran does possess some of these original systems, Much of its network consists of inexpensive replicas of the Russian S-300 and Chinese HQ-7 systems, reverse-engineered versions that until now had not been battle-tested. Now that these Iranian knockoffs have been put to the test in actual combat, they have proven to be lacking. Moreover, because Iran mostly replicated these systems without significant innovation, their versions carry over the same inherent weaknesses as the originals. For example, Iran's copies of the S-300 systems are vulnerable to Israeli weaponry like the Icebreaker missile, which is specifically designed to exploit the electronic warfare vulnerabilities of the radars utilized by S-300 units. Unfortunately for Iran, no measures were taken to patch these critical vulnerabilities in their homegrown models, and the consequences are now being felt on the battlefield. Currently, Iran's air defense capabilities are even weaker than they were previously. According to Newsweek, Iran has likely begun redeploying air defense assets from its eastern regions to the west, in anticipation of more attacks coming from the Western Front. This repositioning reflects a strategic adjustment in response to the persistent U.S. air strikes targeting Iranian positions from that direction. However, this isn't exactly a power play by Iran. What it really means is that Iran's eastern front becomes accessible territory, allowing America's B-52 bombers to launch their standoff munitions from a less defended flank of the country. While Tehran and Isfahan may have stepped up their defenses somewhat following the initial round of strikes, these measures remain insufficient to effectively counter us and Israeli attacks. As Afterburner pointed out, Iran is likely relegated to hoping it scores occasional lucky hits, exploiting any lapses in American vigilance. This approach hardly qualifies as a comprehensive air defense strategy. Rather, it's a risky gamble with payoffs far smaller than Iran desperately needs. On the U.S. side, they enjoy total air superiority, though not quite air supremacy, the state where forces operate with absolute confidence of uncontested control over enemy airspace. Still, the U.S. is close enough to supremacy to commence deploying non-stealth bombers within Iranian territory. This development clearly signals American confidence, much to Iran's dismay, underscoring that President Trump's predictions of a prolonged aerial campaign stretching over several weeks are not empty threats. Expect many more strikes from the expansive B-52 fleet. And that's without even factoring in the capabilities of the U.S. carrier strike groups active in the Persian Gulf, each bringing dozens of fighter jets and auxiliary aircraft to the theater. Looking ahead, the conflict scale is broadening. The campaign is already escalating inside Iran itself. Afterburner notes that the B-52's arrival marks a significant shift towards increased volume and sustained pressure. Beyond this, the geographical range of US attacks is extending, reflecting evolving strategic objectives. For example, on March 4th, the U.S. sank the Iranian vessel Iris Dana in international waters off Sri Lanka's southern coast, a considerable distance from the Persian Gulf. This highlights the U.S. expanding strikes to target Iranian military assets stationed abroad. Adding another layer of complexity is the looming possibility of American ground forces deploying inside Iran. According to Chatham House, such a move would be necessary if the U.S. intends to dismantle Iran's regime. President Trump's express strategy of encouraging Iranian citizens to rise up and overthrow the theocratic government seems more aspirational than practical. The think tank notes there is currently no credible domestic opposition or significant defections from Iran's political or military elite, indicative that ordinary Iranians lack sufficient confidence or capability to topple the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the country's remaining senior leadership. This scenario opens up an intriguing prospect. The deployment of B-52s and the anticipated weeks of relentless airstrikes may be setting the stage for a third phase of the conflict with Iran. Initially, the U.S. executed precise surgical strikes. This was followed by heavier, more forceful blows, the sledgehammer approach. What comes next might well be the next, more intensive chapter of this unfolding war. The prospect of us troops moving onto the ground could overwhelm the Iranian regime. What we do know for sure is that Iran's government has been shaken to its very core, and it might never bounce back completely. While this spells trouble for the regime itself, it also deals a severe blow to Putin. He has been betting heavily on a stronger alliance between Russia and Iran to elevate his status as a dominant player on the global geopolitical stage. Should the Iranian regime collapse, it would be a significant setback for Putin. To understand why, be sure to watch our detailed video. Thank you for tuning in.